Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Many of our webinars address reserve studies at budget time of year. And this webinar is different in that it's designed to help managers make reserve fund decisions throughout the year. Now, a roadmap to success with reserves begins with a successful strategy. Success starts with a board committed to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association, and that maximizes property values and builds a peaceful and productive community. A reserve study helps the board by creating a plan to guide the association into the future. That plan identifies major upcoming expenses and how to prepare financially. So success comes from making decisions, choosing words, and taking actions that support that plan. If you jump right into discussing the numbers with wrong words or a poor strategy, that's going to undermine your plan. So financial success comes from a combination of that good budget and wise decisions that are made on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis throughout the year. So that's what we mean by a roadmap for success. So as you see on screen, there's a display of your control panel. So click the hands raised icon on your control panel, similar to the one you see on screen, if you're ready for us to start today's presentation. Give me a click for hands raised. Very nice. Sean and Paige, we've got a sharp group with us today. Okay, I'm going to click hands down, and we'll get on to the presentation. So, Sean, let's start with the big picture. Tell us what you commonly have to remind your clients about with respect to the purpose of reserve contributions.
Will do. Hi, Robert. First off, let me say I agree that we have a sharp group today. 0% answered what are reserves, and it's always edifying to see that they actually know what we're going to be talking about as we get into it.
I always wonder if we have a comedian in the group, though.
Right, exactly. So the real question is that we want to address is what are reserves for? Are they for now, or are they for the future? A lot of people think they're for the future, but they really are for the here and now. They're for the present. Reserve contributions are not for the future. They're not a slush fund for a rainy day or anything like that. Reserve contributions offset, and folks, you're going to hear me say this a lot. Reserve contributions offset the ongoing daily, weekly, monthly deterioration of the common areas of the association. While reserve expenses are scattered irregularly over the years, reserve contributions offset that ongoing cost of deterioration. And that cost of deterioration is as real as any bill the association has. I'm going to encourage you that anytime the conversation strays towards the future with reserves, bring it back, emphasizing that the deterioration is real, it's right now, and the cost isn't going to go away. Every owner needs to pay their fair share of what they're enjoying and using up that asset right now. So give me hands raised if most of your boards think that reserves are for the future.
Yeah, Sean, looking up and down the list, it looks like about half. Okay,
yeah, it's pretty common.
Okay, all you.
Yeah, and just because the roof doesn't send us a deterioration bill doesn't mean that it's any less of a bill that needs to be paid. So when boards say we can't afford to pay adequate reserve contributions, they need to understand that reserve contributions are a bill that need to be paid just like any other bill. So there are 4 reserve rules that are going to make life a lot easier for our managers and board members. So we might want to keep these 4 reserve rules handy to keep everybody on track. Number 1, reserve expenses are inevitable. Again, the ongoing cost of deterioration is occurring. That 20-year roof didn't fail overnight, and it didn't surprise us. It failed gradually in plain sight, and it lasted over 20 years. The board is responsible to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association. If the board delays and deferred maintenance sets in, those same expenses will only get more expensive. We'll talk about that a little more later. That's a very important point. And then the other really important point is homeowners always get stuck paying the bills. There's no real kicking the can down the road. Most delays only end up costing more money. So keep it simple with these 4 concepts. Same thing. Get ready to pay that bill for ongoing deterioration. We want to make sure that we're remembering to keep the board focused and on target. It's their job to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association. Running the association in a financially sound manner is one of the primary duties of the board. And that usually means, or that does mean, not guessing. Guessing is irresponsible. Time and deterioration marches on. We need to be preparing for that. Delaying just causes the association to get further behind on that ongoing deterioration. So what we're going to do to help you today is turning your reserve numbers into an effective plan.
Well, thanks, Sean. Like you said, that delays, even if well-intended, those delays actually cost the association, their members, a little more money. And let me just take a moment to say that those delays actually expose the board themselves to increased litigation risk. And that's because when they do that, they lose their protection from the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule is how board decisions are going to be measured if they're ever challenged. And boards enjoy protection if they act within the three tenets or the three aspects of the business judgment rule. So that means if they operate with a duty of care, which means making quality decisions like hiring a quality landscaper and not just the cheapest one. A duty of loyalty, which means putting the interest of the association first, and that means often something like raising assessments when the association needs money, even though you'd obviously like to keep assessments low and save money for yourself. And a duty of inquiry means you as a board reach out for information when you don't know the answer. And that's where we fit in with the reserve study, like recommending how much the board needs to set aside to offset ongoing deterioration. Now, like Sean said, guessing is no way to responsibly run a multi-million-dollar not-for-profit real estate corporation. Boards need to care about serving the association well, that's that duty of care, look after its needs, that's a duty of loyalty, and getting wise counsel when the board itself needs help figuring out what to do. So, Sean, what are some of the common questions a manager should be prepared to answer when they're hit with that fundamental question of why should they get or even refer to a reserve study?
Well, the first answer is going to be an updated reserve study helps the association avoid surprises. It's always good to get fresh eyes on things and see, have somebody see things that are coming at you. And with that, you're going to have reduced costs because that's going to minimize, having a good plan is going to minimize that expensive deferred maintenance we've been talking about. It's going to reduce liability. It's going to maximize property values due to the property looking good and being well maintained. And in many states, it's going to keep the association in compliance with state laws. There's also just the intangible benefit of keeping the owners informed, reassuring them that the board has a plan to care for the needs of the association without having to pass a special assessment and deferred payments. But the consequences of not doing it, on the other hand, are being exposed to surprises, being exposed to special assessments, again, deferred maintenance, uninsured liability. And then there's the D's, which are often things like disappointment. People coming home look at how the property looks. It looks awful. There's discouragement. Board members see that they have no money to do projects at a timely manner. There's dysfunction. Boards are not able to do normal board duties because there's no money to do it. Deterioration is rampant in the community because there's no money. Declining home values with poor curb appeal, and then rumors of special assessments. More and more I'm hearing from board members that the real estate agents are letting people know that there's special assessments anticipated in a community, and that definitely hits the appeal of buying inside of communities. And all that ends up with a lot of distrust. Owners are aware that the board is not taking care of the property, and again, it just has a bad effect on the relationship between the board and the ownership. So a lot of times what I'll hear is, well, we'll just do the reserve study to comply with the law, because about 25 states now have a law that mandates doing reserve studies, and that's really not the point. The point is reserve studies are to help the board make informed choices and how to responsibly run their multi-million-dollar not-for-profit real estate corporation.
Well, Sean, it sounds like when you were talking about the D's, that sounded to me like a lot of owners complaining or board members resisting, and it seems like they're kind of in a jam because there's going to be a lot of complaints if they don't raise the assessments, and then there's going to be complaints if they do raise the assessments. And so it seems like they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, so it's just best to do what's best for the association.
Okay, good. And that means, again, duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of inquiry, reaching out and finding out what the right thing is to do. So let's change topics a little bit, talk about boards. The managers are the agents for the board. We've got a lot of board members or homeowners on the webinar with us here in this session, but let's talk about how the board makes decisions. How do you as a manager effectively or encourage or influence the board towards making those wise choices?
Well, we want to make sure that we let them know. Well, number one, in theory, we know that they're responsible to run the association successfully, responsibly, and in a financially sustainable manner. But the reality is that often they act like the job is just to keep the assessments low. Can everybody give me hands up if that's all they hear from their boards is want to keep association dues low?
Sean, I've got a lot of hands up.
Okay.
More than a third, maybe half. Yeah, something. Plenty of them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there is a profile of people who run for the board for that one reason. I want to keep the assessments low, and that usually is a very bad decision to make. They're living in a mindset of limitations and not responsibilities. So there is a better way. We need to remind them repeatedly of their job. We need to help them keep their eye on the ball. And what we'll do today is give you a tool and show them that doing the right thing is actually in their financial best interests. In a study that we concluded last year among comparable associations in a similar geographical area, what you see on screen is we found that home prices on a dollar per square foot basis were 12.6% higher in associations with well-funded reserves, and we consider that above 70% funded. This means that the association in a fiscally responsible manner provides a strong return on home values. A few more dollars spent per month on reserve contributions and monthly assessments will maximize curb appeal and return thousands of dollars to each owner in maximized home values.
Thousands is a nice word.
Yeah, that's real money. Thousands of dollars. It's well worth making sure you're doing the right reserve contributions.
Yeah.
So a roadmap for success starts with a strategy of focusing on a simple message of responsibility, budgeting to offset ongoing deterioration. And that will obviously pay off handsomely and maximize home values. Okay, let's talk about the actual reserve study, putting it into practice throughout the year. I'm going to give you some tips on how to save time and encourage your board to make wise financial decisions. First thing I want to remind you of is that these are not ideas just produced by association reserves. We're going to talk about things that come from National Reserve Study standards that were established back in 1998. And I always encourage my boards and my managers to know National Reserve Study standards. It gives us solid ground to discuss the topics that we're discussing. And so with that, there are 3 different types of reserve studies, and the boards need to know that. And they understand that there's a full reserve study, which we call level 1, and an update level 2 reserve study or update with site visit, and a level 3 reserve study, which is an update no site visit. So reserve studies come in 3 flavors. An expensive full reserve study typically only needs to be done once. A lot of the times I will get managers and board members saying, we need a full reserve study. And I will look it up in our database and say, no, actually you need an update with site visit because I already measured and counted all of your light bulbs. So hire us for a with site visit, it's much cheaper. And the vast majority of reserve studies performed in the US are the less expensive with site visit, no site visit updates. Most update with site visits are done every 3 to 5 years. And that's sometimes influenced by state law requirements, like here in California with the Dave Sterling Act. The no site visit updates are generally done in those years in between. But again, the update products are much less expensive than a full first-time engagement. And with that, remember that there are 3 parts to every reserve study. The first part is the component list, which I call the building blocks of the study. And that's something I always encourage every board member and every manager to become very acquainted with, because that really is the prize data that we want that's going in. And that identifies the association's major repair and replacement projects. If you want more information on components, we had an entire webinar on components, which we called Reserve Studies 101. And definitely encourage you to go back and look at that. And I'll summarize that webinar by telling you, I'm going to show you in this webinar how to make sure all the right components are in a reserve study. So this is what I was talking about being familiar with National Reserve Study standards. A lot of managers will ask questions about why is this component included and this one isn't. This is our guide right here. By definition, a reserve component must meet the National Reserve Study Standards 4-part test that you see on screen. To be funded through reserve, a project needs to be common area maintenance responsibility. And that does seem like it's common sense, but we'll come back to a little bit later of why that's important. It needs to have a limited useful life. It needs to have a predictable remaining useful life and be above a minimum cost threshold of significance. Projects that pass the 4-part test are the ones that we want to fund through reserves. And that's a significant point that again, we'll talk about more later on in the program.
Got it. Okay. Now that you know the 4-part test and you know how the reserve components have been selected, they will all cycle through to get replaced. And so those expenses are all going to happen. But in your experience, is there any way to save money on those inevitable reserve expenses?
Yes, absolutely. Because remember, most of the reserve decisions through the year will be on spending choices. So making smart spending choices is a good strategy. The biggest thing that we're going to do to avoid those big expenses is avoid deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is very expensive, so your best bet is to cut costs, is to avoid deferred maintenance. Do we always? Well, let me ask you this: give me hands raised if you think you should always do the project when remaining useful life hits 0.
Yeah, Sean, we may have a pretty sharp group with us. It's about maybe a quarter. So I'm going to put hands down, okay?
All right, they are smart, because the answer is not always. Projects fail differently, right? That we have 5 different failure modes. And so when we look at that, sometimes there will be an inconsequential component that's in failure mode. That failure mode is no big deal, like a pool heater going out. A lot of board members will say, we're just going to let that go till it dies, and that's fine. We'll just fix that when it fails. Then there's other reevaluate types of failure, like a wobbly perimeter fence. We're going to say, hey, we're going to keep our eye on that fence. If it starts to become structurally unsound, we want to replace it, but we're going to reevaluate that each year. Then there's obsolescence, the outdated furniture in the lobby, old exercise equipment. These 2 categories have soft replacement schedules. They may never fail, but you do want to replace them when they're due because they're outdated. The lobby furniture is ugly. It's older decor, stuff like that. Then there are the protection projects. Now notice that we're in the red here. That these are things that we really want to keep our eye on. This is like painting your wood trim or sealing your asphalt or sealing the decks. Scheduled projects, these are scheduled projects you need to do on time, or they will create additional costs through that deferred maintenance we're talking about. And then finally, there are the catastrophic projects like entry access limitation systems, fire alarm systems, elevator modernization, or hot water systems. Waiting for failure for these projects would be very disruptive to the community, increase costs, so it's wise not to delay. The bottom line, don't delay red protection or catastrophic projects. So now here is an example of what I've been talking about with a protection project. This protection project was delayed. Slurry sealing is an inexpensive 15 cents per square foot project, and this community left it undone for many years, and that led to unchecked deterioration to surfaces, which ended up requiring a really expensive remove and replace project that was about 20 times the cost of the seal code. It just wasn't wise to delay it, and now they're having a real mess on their hands.
And that's the kind of bill that the homeowners always get stuck paying.
Yep, exactly. And here we have a similar protection project, metal work that went unpainted because the board wanted to quote unquote save money. But that meant a $10 per linear foot repaint project became a $50 per linear foot repair project that still needs to be painted. And Robert, as we've talked about, as you can see, there's already weld marks on it. So this board made the bad decision of doing 2 repair projects rather than just actually doing the painting project that they were supposed to do. So we want to remember that remember the 4 reserve rules. Deterioration is inevitable. And then look at this roof. It was a reevaluate project. It had a remaining life of 1 on their reserve study, and that reserve study is 3 years old. The board didn't do anything. Delays in replacing that roof led to big leaks and big water intrusion and repair bills. It was extremely disruptive to the owners and significant overruns on costs because the roofer was having to do things in an emergency manner. Waiting too long got very expensive and very disruptive for that community.
Yeah, it's hard to challenge Mother Nature. Those things just happen. Well, thanks, Sean. Let me move on and show you, as we've been talking about components, this is what a typical reserve component list looks like according to National Reserve Study standards. It has the project description, useful life, remaining useful life in years, and the current cost. Remember that these were all selected by that 4-part test. And I'm going to set you up with a question here. Notice that the second line is pool resurface. But in this case, let me suggest that the board tells you that the manager, that the pool heater has failed, but clearly it doesn't appear as a component on the reserve study. So what do? Can you spend reserves on a project that doesn't appear in your reserve study?
The short answer is, of course, yes. The first thing I think we want to double check in the reserve study and see if it's in the numbers somewhere. Maybe that line should have been called pool system. If you don't find any detailed description of the component, you should call your reserve study provider. They might be able to point you in the right direction. They're part of your team. And we all want the association to have as accurate of a reserve study as possible. So definitely call your reserve analyst, talk them through it. And your reserve study provider will probably refer to the 4-part test. But it's important to remember that reserve projects are defined by the 4-part test, not the reserve component list. As I've said before, reserve analysts might be the smartest guys in the room, but they do miss things. So check with the reserve study provider. If it passes the 4-part test, if it's a legitimate reserve expense, spend the money from reserves. And then what you're going to want to do is make sure you send a note to your reserve study provider and remind them or her that it's got to appear in the next update and that the pool heater should appear and we should start funding for that ongoing deterioration. So that's how we decide about a component that doesn't appear in a reserve study, and it's an example of how your reserve study is going to get better each time it's updated. So what if it costs more or less? This is actually a really burning question I get from a lot of managers. The first thing I'm going to say to them is perform the project. Remember that that's the board's responsibility. You need to help them achieve that primary goal. Figure that the reserve funds will be reallocated in the next update, whether the project is more or less budget. The costs appearing in the reserve study are just budget estimates. Most of the time, the costs are not going to be 100% on because we use rounded numbers. So it's not a big deal if the costs are a little bit more or less. Here's the key point. If a reserve expense is different than expected in either cost or timing, spend the money from reserves and adjust the cost or life estimates in the next update. Here's a little tip that I often tell board members. If a project is minor enough that it doesn't affect the remaining useful life, like a local roof repair, that's a maintenance expense. It's just a good way to show the maintenance versus reserves decision. I want to point out that there's an asterisk next to the second bullet because in some states there are requirements to separate reserves between components. Not spending fence, an example would be not spending fence money on roofing projects and vice versa. So again, if you're in one of those states, check with your reserve provider. But that again is usually handled just by an interfund transfer and reallocating funds in the next reserve study update. The bottom line is we need to help the board fulfill their responsibility to maintain, preserve the common areas. And delaying major projects regularly gets expensive with that deferred maintenance. And again, the homeowners always get stuck with the bill.
Yeah. Hey, Sean, you've spoken about being able to spend reserves on projects that don't appear on the reserve component list, but don't you have to be a little careful when it comes to capital improvements?
Yes, absolutely. That's the literal $1 million question in a lot of cases. If it's a natural upgrade, if it was a reserve project and the upgrade is just to a new material or technology, it's still a reserve project. The key distinction there is if the project or asset actually exists. So adding an entirely new asset like a dock or a tennis court where one didn't previously exist, that's a capital improvement that's not legitimate to use reserve funds for that. So again, if the asset or project exists is our key distinction there. Remember that reserves offset ongoing deterioration that affects existing assets. This is not a slush fund to buy new things for the association.
Okay, great. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual money in reserves. Let's move on from the components. We have a webinar called Reserve Studies 102 that's devoted to this entire subject. But Sean, can you give today's audience a few communication tips about finances?
Sure, absolutely. Well, often the cash numbers seem really big, and that's just a fact. But everything is expensive, and reserve projects takes years of financial preparation. So with usage terminology, it's always best to discuss the reserve fund size in terms of percent funded. Dollars can sound big, but they are only meaningful when compared to the needs of the association. Like $500,000 can sound like a big number, so you realize that's only 23% of what they should have at this time. Percent funded helps you and the board know, the balance between reserve cash and the needs of the association. We want to think of it as keeping up with the baseline. Remember that the cost of deterioration is ongoing, like I've been saying, and the percent funded reveals if the ongoing reserve contributions have kept pace and with the ongoing deterioration over the years, or if they've fallen behind. So we want to look and see if we're keeping up with that world record. And a lot of the times we don't, and that's when we fall in percent funded and fall down to special assessment territory. And that brings us to this next slide, which this is a cross section of percent funded for associations across the country. The weak associations in red are on the left, and the strong associations in green are on the right. The red associations are the ones with special assessments, deferred maintenance, turmoil, and other problems. Green ones on the right are the responsible associations that have been funding for that ongoing deterioration. They're easier to manage. There's money to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association. Just everything's better in those associations. And as you can see, the largest block association in the country are actually the yellow ones in the middle. That's a big question I often get. And I always say the most associations are right there in the middle. But the problem with being in the red is this chart shows you of why that percent funded matters. This chart shows you that you can predict most special assessments. You can see them coming years and years in advance. They're common when an association is 0 to 30% funded. Once you get in that red zone, you've got a high risk of special assessment. Now, special assessments are uncommon in the yellow area, and they're very rare in the green zone. One thing I want to direct everybody to look at is the difference between 30% funded and over 30% funded is pretty big. And so with your associations that are not well funded, getting them above 30% funded is a big step in the right direction. And ultimately, we want to get up to 100% funded.
Well, thanks, Sean. Now let's move on to the last of the three reserve study parts, the actual funding plan. You talked about how much cash is in reserves and measuring that by percent funded. And again, we've got an entire webinar dedicated to the topic of how we calculate how much it takes on an ongoing basis for those contributions to offset deterioration. And remember, that's what the board needs to know to fulfill their responsibility to take care of the association's common areas, part of their duty of inquiry. But instead of calculations, Sean, tell us first why boards should care to get their budgeted contributions right.
Well, because budgeted contributions are how every owner pays their fair share of that steady, predictable, ongoing deterioration. It's a way to make sure that funds exist when they're needed. I always say, remember that the future takes care of itself when you take care of business today. This is how associations avoid unfair special assessments and deferred maintenance. And all of this is part of the roadmap to success. We play the strategy of emphasizing that contributions are not for the future. Reserve contributions offset ongoing deterioration with properly sized contributions. And with those properly sized contributions, everyone pays their fair share. Projects get done on time, deferred maintenance and cost overruns are eliminated, and curb appeal and property values are maximized. So that's all great stuff for an association.
Okay, again, we talked about theory here, but can you nudge us in the right direction and maybe give people an idea about how large typical reserve contributions are?
Sure. Well, here's a cross-section profile among all associations across the country. This is consistent whether it's a high-rise, mid-rise, townhome, or planned community. Reserve projects are expensive. They require funds and lots of them. As you can see, the adequate contributions stretch from 15 to 40%, with most associations requiring about 25% of the total budget going towards reserves. This might be a typical association's single largest budget line item, and that's a big deal, and it's important to get it right. Here's another way to visualize it. As you see, 15 to 40% is typical, but 25% is a good guess to get in the right ballpark. This is a big chunk of the total budget, but remember, it's the board's job to protect, maintain, and enhance the assets of the association.
Yeah, that's a big point there, that it is the board's job. And I bet if we could see people in the audience, they're probably shaking their heads thinking, wow, 25% is a lot to set aside. And they may be scrambling to look at their budgets to do a little calculation to see what fraction their reserve contributions are. So Sean, what do you say to boards who tell you that that's more than they think they can afford at this point in time?
Well, it is a pretty common complaint that I get, and I understand it because so many associations are underfunded, and boosting the reserve contribution is uncomfortable because again, most people are in the mindset of we want to keep dues low, but adequate reserve contributions are very affordable. Reserve contributions are about $3 to $5 per day for the typical condominium owner. That's about the cost of a premium coffee per day. And again, being down here in South Orange County, I see a lot of people with that premium coffee every single day. So I tell people, don't let any owner or board tell you that they can't afford it, so that they don't want to afford it. Anybody who can afford a coffee drink per day can afford adequate reserve contributions. Another point I wanted to make on this is remember we got to remember our 4 rules that homeowners always get stuck paying the bill. Foolish boards make it expensive for the owners who live there. Another way to minimize reserve contributions is to pay for reserve projects with ongoing budgeted contributions. On screen, you can see that due to compounded interest, even at just 1% that we've been seeing, owners can pay for a $250,000 roof over a 15-year period with only $232,000 of their own money. The bank's going to pay the rest with earned interest. If they wait to the last minute and they try to get a loan, normal loan rates will end up having that roof cost about $320,000. So that's about $90,000 more than had they paid for it with ongoing contributions, and that's a lot of coffee.
That's a lot of coffee, and I was thinking that it's nice to have your friend the bank to come alongside you and pay you money, so you can help pay for that roof bill. Well, what do you do if don't you still have some clients that tell you that you recommended contributions, you've made the point, you've made the argument, but it's just still more than they can handle this year?
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. I have a lot of my clients that I call my little engines that could, and what I tell them is we've got a solution for that. We remind them that it likely took many years for them to get into this situation. Don't blame the prior board. It's decisions that were made 20 years ago. And it's going to take a multi-year plan to get them out. So if your recommended contributions increase too steep, we could work the program and have it so that we're doing what we call the $10 solution. That's a multi-year plan. That means raising their reserve contributions by $10 per month per owner this year. and then another $10 per month per owner increase in the following years. So that in just 2 to 5 years, all of a sudden that association who's nowhere near their adequate reserve contributions are all of a sudden right at their adequate reserve contributions and building strength in the reserve funds. So can everybody give me a hands raise if they think $10 solution is doable for their community?
A lot of hands, Sean. A lot of hands.
This is a sharp group.
Yep. Okay, Sean, thanks so much. Let me get the slide to move. All right, well, let me jump in and handle a real quick one. It's kind of a red herring. Some of you managers are going to get challenged about the way the contributions are calculated, straight line or cash flow. And I just want to emphasize that this should not be a big deal. It's almost like choosing a vehicle nowadays. You can get one that gets you from here to there using gasoline, diesel, hybrid, or all electric. But remember, both fund exactly the same projects defined by the 4-part test. It's exactly the same expenses. So the contributions are going to come out in the wash. So don't sweat that problem. And the theme today has been strategy. You heard that a lot from Sean. You hear it from myself. It's your decision points, your talking points. Sean, can you close out the session today with some ways to save time and how to measure success?
Absolutely. The first way to save time is, let's talk about the reserve study itself. Okay. We want to know what we're looking for in there. We want to look for the fiscal year, make sure we're looking at the right fiscal year and what year was prepared. Reserve studies do get old and outdated quickly. We want to look at what type of reserve study it is. We want to look and see if it's a full or if it's a with site or if it's a no site visit update. And that tells us how exhaustively the report was prepared. And then look at the component list. Remember I talked about that's the building blocks of our reserve study. Hopefully you have a reserve study that component list is based on our National Reserve Study Standards 4-part test. And it's going to give you an evaluation of the reserve fund strength measured by percent funded and a multi-year funding plan. Those 3 things are parts of every reserve study you should have. And if you just receive that reserve study, you should distribute at least the executive summary. That should go to all owners. I would leave the complete reserve study for those who specifically request it. There's a lot of numbers in there that people can get lost in the weeds. Many management company owners or companies charge owners to provide them with a copy of the entire reserve study, and that's usually because it's a pretty big document. So with the ongoing accounting, one contribution or many, on a monthly basis, we should literally just, by all means, just do the reserve fund and transfer it to the reserve fund. And the question is, how do we account for it? And for most associations, I'm going to recommend you just deposit it and let it be, and then spend those reserve funds on legitimate reserve projects. In most cases, you can save a lot of time by skipping the step of dividing up the contribution into all those line items. They're just going to get rebalanced and redistributed in the next fiscal year anyways. And so that's just going to save the manager a whole lot of time. And so ultimately, how do we measure success? I measure success by lack of special assessments, by projects getting done on time, and with the association being over 70% funded. I measure success in that reserves are spent appropriately on projects that pass the 4-part test, and that the operating fund is standing on its own. We're not borrowing from reserves to help out the operating. And what's a good process for each year? We want to use fresh information, especially for a line item such as large as the reserve contributions. All reserve study information changes on an ongoing basis. Like I said earlier, some states require a pattern with site visit updates every 3 to 5 years. I think that's a good standard overall. And I think even if you don't have those requirements, you should probably get a new reserve study every 3 to 5 years, or new on-site study every 3 to 5 years. Okay, among our clients, boards that update their reserve study annually have about 30% fewer special assessments, and that's because basically they're keeping their eye on the ball. They're making necessary annual adjustments to make sure their contribution rates are keeping up with ongoing deterioration, and they're avoiding falling down below 30% funded.
So they're balancing and alternating between the update with site visits and the update no site visits, and like I say, just keeping their eye on the ball.
Yeah, absolutely. And what to do if a board still doesn't care. If we have a stubborn board that's sitting on their hands and not wanting to make adequate reserve contributions, even after you've explained it, that it's their job and that their property values will rise if they do it, just protect yourself. Hopefully you've done your best reminding them that reserve contributions offset that ongoing deterioration, that those contributions are as necessary as paying any other bill that the association has. And you've been guiding them to only spend reserves on projects that match the 4-part test. But protect yourself, document your recommendations in official meeting minutes, and go home and rest well as that board moves closer to special assessments and declining property values. You've done their job, and the problems that are going to rise are their problem, not yours.
Yeah, it's hard work being a manager, but you do need to separate yourself from the consequences that foolish decisions just fall on the shoulders of the board and the owners. Well, thanks, Sean. What I hear you saying overall is that with respect to reserves, a roadmap for success boils down to collecting what's necessary, knowing your components, the building blocks, as you said, spending it wisely, and then adjusting the plan regularly. And that's what leads to places like this peaceful and productive community that we see on screen and that we hope we can all create. Well, that's the end of our prepared curriculum for today. I want to leave you with encouragement that we have additional written and video resources on our website. Scroll to the bottom of our homepage if you want to sign up to be notified of upcoming programs like this one. And a link on the top of our homepage leads to an easy way you can request a proposal if you'd like us to update your reserve study. And in addition, as Paige said earlier, we'll send an outline to everyone who fills out a short survey at the end of today's program. As a special bonus, I'll include a link in that outline to the original roadmap article published in CAI's Common Ground, and that's the article that inspired this webinar. So at this time, we'll transition to a brief Q&A time, and I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will serve as our MC. Paige.